We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
Watch me for the signal there, sir. Start.
I'll start when you throw it down.
Wait a minute. Hold it, boys. Everybody ready?
Yeah. Major Keyhole, as author of the book Flying Saucers Are Real, what is your opinion of these new sightings of unidentified objects?
With all due respect to the Air Force, I believe that some of them will prove to be of interplanetary origin. During a 3-year investigation, I found that many pilots have described objects of substance and high speed. One case, pilots reported their plane was buffeted by an object which passed them at 500 miles an hour. Obviously, this was a solid object, and I believe it was from outer space.
UFOs have emerged from the shadows. Conversations regarding unidentified flying objects, now referred to as Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, UAP, used to linger in the outskirts of society. The subject carried negative connotations, causing many to stay clear due to concerns of being labeled as unconventional thinkers. Yet, a transformation has unfolded in recent years. Respected scientists and political figures now advocate for the transparency and investigation of UFOs. I had the opportunity to have a conversation with David Marler, who's an author, a UFO historian, and the founder of the National UFO Record Center. In our conversation, we explore the past of UFOs and drew parallels with the ongoing current events within the realm of UAP. Join us as we get rebelliously curious. David, thank you so much for being on Rebelliously Curious with me. It's been a while that I've been trying to get you on the show. You've been so busy with everything that you're doing at the National UFO Historical Record Center. So thank you for being here today with me.
No, thank you for your tenacity and your patience in dealing with my crazy schedule. It's great to be here, Chrissy.
It's good to have you. So I'd like just to start off, what is the National UFO Historical Record Center? Just for people that are not very sure of what it is. And then what kind of files do you have there right now that people would be interested in maybe looking at, or different cases that you have that people might want to learn a little bit more about?
Sure. First, let me give you a little bit of backstory. I got involved actively in UFOs back in 1990. And when I joined MUFON at the time, I remember saying to myself, if I'm going to go out and say I'm a UFO investigator, I really need to know the history of the subject. I better, be well read on the subject because people are going to ask me questions. I naively went to my local libraries, and to my dismay, there were few, if any, UFO books on the shelf. And I remember saying at that time, and this was rather naive in retrospect, well, I guess if I need a library of UFO books, I'm going to have to create my own. You can see just a portion of now where I'm at, fast forwarding 34 years later. And I naively thought I'd have a little bookshelf in my living room, but this has developed into a large scale archive. And the National UFO Historic Record Center really took it to another level. Both myself and the historians and archivists across the country, the leading historians and archivists that I've worked with very collaboratively over the years, we've all amassed our own personal collections of news clippings, audio recordings, videos, books, journals, case files, etc. And we decided that as a lot of them are getting older, we needed to have a succession plan. And rather than being reactive, I always like to be proactive. And so I thought to myself, well, why don't we create an institution that's founded on preserving these collections, preserving the raw materials, the history of the subject going back to at least 1947, and then develop an idea of centralizing all of that under one roof. And as I mentioned at the UFO Congress back in 2022, we have the National Archives, which is great, and we have the National UFO Reporting Center. But what if we married those two ideas together? We could have the National Archives of Ufology, and that's essentially what the National UFO Historical Record Center is. We founded it in November of 2022. and we're a 501c3 organization based here in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area. And in the last year, we have just received a huge amount of UFO collections, both domestically and internationally, which really kind of exceeded our initial expectations. We were looking just here in the United States and Canada in trying to centralize a lot of this material in North America. One of my colleagues has also reached out to researchers in South America, and we're promised this year or next year to receive some Brazilian UFO case files and collections. So this idea has really just snowballed in developing much larger than what we originally envisioned, this huge archive. And this year in 2024, we're in the process of working with local business leaders and organizations, and we may be very close to securing an actual public-facing archive building.
That's so exciting. You have so many files. Right now, it's the world's largest, correct?
Well, we believe it's the world's largest. It is definitively the largest collection in North America of case files. And just for your audience, just real briefly, I'll touch on some of the larger collections. Going back to the early 1950s, there was an organization called Civilian Saucer Intelligence, or CSI, not the TV show, but Civilian Saucer Intelligence. They had different chapters. New York and Los Angeles were some of the larger groups. We have the majority of their case files going back to the mid-1950s. We have the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP, which was the largest investigative organization that was led by Major Donald Kehoe. An incredible amount of history in those case files. Later in 1973, the Center for UFO Studies was founded by Dr. J. Allen Hynek. We have their case files in addition to Hynek's personal Air Force Project Blue Book files, original Air Force documents, which have a lot of his marginalia and notes. So it's more information than you might garner going to the National Archives, just looking at the reports themselves, because you get Hynek's take on some of these cases and his take on some of the official Air Force explanations. But most recently, and this has really been a crowning achievement as a relatively new organization, in November of 2023, we secured the APRO files, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization case files. This was really the first well-organized UFO organization in the United States. And as I like to say, they created the template for all these other organizations I mentioned, including MUFON, because certainly MUFON didn't come into being until 1969. But Coral and Jim Lorenzen, a husband and wife couple, started in Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. They moved around a couple times due to their jobs, but for a period of about 2 or 3 years, actually had APRO here in New Mexico, in Alamogordo. They both worked at Holloman Air Force Base as civilian contractors. And then later they moved and established APRO, which is more wide known, having their headquarters in Tucson, Arizona.
Oh, that's fitting too, that what they were working on the base.
Oh, absolutely. And they garnered a lot of interesting military reports. And there's a couple little things I'd like to share, hopefully, in our discussion later that I'll share with you and your audience that I've just recently discovered in those files.
Okay, yes. And I would love, just in the APRO behind you, like what is consisting of the APRO files? You know, because right now I would just think that it would just be documentation, but right. I know we were talking just earlier behind you that there's like physical, elements. There's like,
yes.
From the glove that we're looking at. I'll let you explain it in the back what that is. Yeah,
this is just one example of the things that have literally been locked away for 35 years. This collection was not readily accessible for that period of time. But what we have here is an example of some of the artifacts from some of these historic UFO cases. This is one of the most well-known, and I would say arguably the most credible case in Canadian UFO history. This is from the Falcon Lake, Manitoba case from May 20th, 1967. And what we're looking at is right here, a portion of the burned shirt from this situation that involved a gentleman by the name of Stephen Mihalik, who was burned by a UFO as he came in close proximity to it. And this is the glove that purportedly touched the landed UFO or flying saucer that actually burned the fingertips of the glove. And you've seen this in photographs. Your audience can look that case up and see the photographs online. But these are the original artifacts, including contemporaneous photos. And we also have audio recordings. We have over 300 reel-to-reel audio recordings, which I've just begun digitizing. We have interviews involving the investigators and involving Stephen Mihalik from that case. So these are possibly recordings that have not been heard by the general public in many cases. And so we look not only, as you mentioned, to talk about the paper documents, the documentation, there's the news clippings, there's the audio recordings, and in some cases, actual original artifacts from these wonderful stories and narratives.
How do you start and become a really great UFO historian? I would say you are one of my favorites. So I would just love to know from a professional how you go about starting in this career.
Well, I say you start off with this and you also end with this. You start off very humble. You go in acknowledging you don't have any answers to this subject. All you can do is gather, as my friend Barry Greenwood likes to say, puzzle pieces, elements of these cases. And what you find is that the more that you expose yourself to the UFO community and work with, as I recommend, if you're in your 20s, then look for the people that are in their 60s or 70s that have been doing this for decades, because don't go down the rabbit holes that they did that only lead to dead ends. Learn from the aging historians that are out there, because they've probably gone down multiple avenues already. Don't waste your time repeating failed mistakes. So I've really worked kind of under the tutelage of Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldridge, who, in my opinion, are two of the leading historians. Barry Greenwood is on our board of directors, and Jan Aldridge works very collaboratively with us. And in fact, both of those gentlemen are progressively donating their collections here as well, to just add to that growing body of data. But really, first and foremost, doing what I said, start reading up on the subject. And I would caution, when I started back in 1990, the internet wasn't what it was. Back then, it was just bulletin boards, as I can recall. But I would not use as your primary source the internet. It's basic, old-fashioned, breaking open a book and reading it, whether it's digital or paper. But read the books, read the documents, read the material that's out there, read the literature. Not only get to know the material, but also research the author. Because, Chrissy, as I know you know, there's a lot of prolific material that's out there, but ultimately when you trace it back, it goes back to non-credible sources. So research the authors as well as the works that they've written, and really rely on those senior researchers to help guide you as far as what's credible and what's not. And an example of that too is, I mentioned don't repeat similar mistakes. I was just recently working on this the other day with Barry Greenwood, and this really underscores, this touches on why to be a historian, how to be a good historian, but it also underscores why we need to research and understand the UFO history. This is an image that you see all the time on the internet, and it's now resurfacing again on Reddit and on Twitter or X. And in this particular instance, these are just some printouts I pulled randomly. I put together a case file on this. Younger people and older people alike are reposting this saying, look, it's the dead alien from Roswell, or look, it's an alien cadaver from a UFO crash. This one actually ties it to the Roswell incident, which it's not. This one ties it to Soviets disclose alien body photos. And ultimately, though, for those that just take a photo and retweet it without investigating it, all you're doing is helping disseminate false information. And you always hear the refrain about the government having put disinformation out there. Chrissy, in my experience, I've seen more ufologists disseminate false information than I've ever seen directly the government doing it. And if you're not vetting the material before you outsource it and share it with others, you're part of the problem. You're not part of the solution. The reason I bring this up is I've known for years, and my colleagues known for years, this is a much better, cleaner picture of that same body or purported body. But this, in fact, was a display that was on in Canada, in Montreal, and it was part of a great exposition. So this is actually the source of that supposed alien cadaver. It was an exhibition called Strange World at the Pavillon des Insolites. I'm probably mispronouncing that, and I apologize. And it was an exhibition in Montreal, and it was from the late 70s to the early 80s. And this was posted around 1978. And we even know there's been interviews with this woman. Linda Caraveau was the one that actually sculpted this display piece, and she nicknamed it the Man of My Dreams. And you can find all this online if you actually do your due diligence. But I just want to mention that here's a clear photo. It's not grainy. Here's a clear photo, but inevitably you're going to see these grainy photos that purportedly go back to 1947. And this is just one obvious example of people that will take something and run with it. And as I always like to say, one of the biggest things that we as historians have to battle, and even credible researchers investigating contemporary cases, is fighting the will to believe. People want to believe so bad. They want to believe that this happened, that Roswell happened, that we have dead aliens, that we have bodies, that they'll cling to anything. And then without any regard for legitimacy, they'll throw that information and recirculate it. What we're trying to do at the National UFO Historical Record Center is gather, and this is just one example, gather that history, that lineage. As I always like to say, the data is only as good as the provenance of the data. But if we can trace these stories back and deconstruct them, we hear about reverse engineering alien spacecraft. We need to reverse engineer these narratives and determine, do they have a legitimate source or do they not? And unfortunately, in most cases in the UFO field, more often than not, a lot of these do not have an established provenance. And we can certainly look at examples of government documents that have been circulated, purported government documents that don't have an established provenance. And there have been belief systems built around those. Cases involving contactee claims, photographs, videos, etc. Government insiders, whistleblowers. Some people, just have this fervent will and desire to believe that even if you very politely and casually question any one element of any of those narratives, it's met with fierce resistance. It's almost to the point with some individuals you deal with in the field, it borders on religious ideation. It's almost like telling a Christian that Jesus is not the Messiah. The reaction that engenders, that reaction that you elicit from these individuals. And as I like to say, both in investigating and in questioning, it all has to stem from here, not here. We should remove emotion and use our intellect to analyze this, because if this is in fact, if we really want to view and frame the UFO subject as a science, as a scientific discipline, we need to remove this. The emotion needs to be removed if we're truly going to be objective. If you're infused with emotion, if you're infused with belief, your objectivity is non-existent.
I think that's really well said, to be honest. And I agree. I think within the science perspective, you do have to remove the emotion to get to, looking at data and getting to the core evidence and looking at, what is this potentially something else than maybe than what I thought it was, or, maybe it's, taking away that belief process. But I do agree with that. I also think that at times then when we do have a better understanding in that, we can look at this from our heart and our perspective through our heart when it comes into humanitarian cases and things that have happened with people. But you're right, you do have to remove first that aspect to be able to get to other truth cores and through scientific data. So,
and Chrissy, I think you've heard me say, it doesn't matter what you believe, with all due respect to the UFO subject. It only matters what the data reflects.
For sure.
And it applies to me equally. I try to present the evidence objectively as best as I've been able to assemble it. But if there's an individual that comes forward and presents information I didn't have that completely deconstructs what I just presented, I will be the first to acknowledge that.
For sure.
I'm trying to really project an objective view of the subject matter. Some individuals, though, come in with a subjective view. They already have an idea a priori of what they think this is, and then they try to, use that confirmation bias to build that argument to support their preconceived belief. I really came in not knowing what the subject was all about. As I mentioned, I was relatively humble. I felt like there might be something there. Where there's smoke, there's fire. And I still believe that. I do believe, despite all the misidentifications and misinformation, disinformation out there, I do believe that at the core, there is still a genuinely mysterious objective phenomena, plural, that we need to understand.
Yeah, and I'd like to go back a little bit, comparing the past to the present. There's so much that's going on with David Grush, obviously him speaking about multiple different things as a whistleblower. Then we look at, hearings that are happening with him. We look at things that are going on in politics right now within Congress. You know, is the past repeating itself right now? Are we seeing that historically other UFO related stories and other related government things that have happened in the past happening again? Are we going through this circle that we just keep repeating the same things, but we never really get to a conclusion?
It does seem to be like that to some extent, Chrissy. Although I'll say that historically, we've never been where we are today, right now, with regard to the subject. And I say that very specifically because for decades, despite the Air Force investigating the subject, the CIA, the FBI, et cetera, wading into the UFO pool and looking at the information and quite often putting out, erroneous conclusions and answers to debunk the subject. We are in a whole different space now as it relates to the subject since 2017. The New York Times article, as I like to say, was kind of a watershed moment. It really changed everything and where all the successive things that have happened since then. As I've said in local interviews here in Albuquerque on TV news and as well as radio, the United States government has acknowledged there is a phenomenon, whatever it is. That is a 180 from where we were back during Project Blue Book era, where they acknowledge that, UFOs don't constitute a threat to national security. UFOs do not seem to exhibit any type of scientific principles beyond our understanding, and no UFOs have been determined to be extraterrestrial. When you look at the National Defense Authorization Act, and more specifically the reports that they've issued in 2021, 22, 23, they acknowledge there is a phenomenon. They do have the category other, which leaves it open to the possibility we could be dealing with extraterrestrials, although that has to be proven by them and by science as a whole. But the report also states, as you know, that some of these UFOs, demonstrate flight dynamics that we don't understand. So clearly, they're not operating within the confines of physics as we know it, that we're trying to understand how do these things even begin to operate. So when you look at that and you go back to the 1969 conclusions of Blue Book, it's a 180 on almost every single one of these. Now, where history repeats itself is we're seeing with Congress and members of Congress what we saw with Blue Book. And again, this is written about by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt back in the day, back in the 1950s and even late 40s. There were what they call the pro-saucer individuals within government and the anti-saucer elites. And depending on who was in charge of the program, depending on who had more clout at any given time, those individuals could influence how the UFO investigations were going. For example, we had Project Sign that started off as a genuinely curious exploration of these initial reports that were coming forward and surfacing. Again, we have to think back, and this is where history repeats itself also. 1947, we're faced with this mystery. 2 years after the conclusion of World War II, we have unknown aircraft moving in United States airspace. What's the first thing that military authorities are thinking? Soviets, the Russians. We were all vying for Nazi scientists and aviation technology at the end of World War II. Now we have Kenneth Arnold saying he sees 9 crescent-shaped objects flying near Mount Rainier. Well, Mount Rainier is just over the Bering Strait from our friends in Russia. So they entered into it not to prove or disprove aliens. They looked at this as a national security potential threat. That is why we are where we are today with the United States government and Congress looking at this. This could be a potential threat to national security. Now, I know a lot of people out there, they take issue with that, especially when people like Chris Mellon or Lou Elizondo or others have said that. The key word is potential threat. Because admittedly, yes, we've been dealing with this UFO subject at least since 1947. We're still here to talk about it. As people say, they haven't landed on the White House lawn, they haven't eaten us. But anyone in a position, and I'm not talking John Q. Public, I'm talking people like Chris Mellon who worked at the Pentagon. When you are in those positions, your job, the way your brain is wired, is to look at everything as a potential threat to national security. UFOs, UAPs should be no different. And so this is why we pay our tax money to support these organizations. That's why we have a defense spending bill, because first and foremost, your task as a political official, as military, is to protect the electorate. And so I don't fault when they make statements like that, because at the end of the day, we don't know what we're dealing with. It's been 75 plus years. We're still wrestling with those fundamental questions. What are we dealing with? Where are they from? What are their motivations? Why are they here?
Yeah, and you're bridging right into a question I have about Project Blue Book. Yeah, there was a press conference that was done with Major General John A. Sanford, where he made a statement about flying saucers. And he says, the Air Force says, is that A, there's no threat from UAPs or UFOs at that time, using that vernacular,
Mhm.
that the US government is no way connected to any secret development. Can you walk me through that press conference so if people are not familiar with it? And I'm going to clip it in as well. So if I
Oh,
can, if YouTube lets me,
absolutely.
clip it in and then just walk us through the press conference. And then how have these two narratives developed since then compared to now?
Absolutely. First, for some context, General Sanford had this press conference, which, by the way, was the largest press conference in D.C. since the end of World War II. He held this press conference to allay concerns on the part of the public as well as the press that were demanding answers because the 2 consecutive weekends prior to that, they had overflights over Washington, D.C. of unknown objects. Now, these were not just visual observations, these were tracked by radar. Multiple radar systems and jet interceptors were sent up to try to identify and potentially intercept these objects. Because again, these were not just UFO sightings. These were UFO sightings over sensitive military restricted areas, the White House, the Capitol, et cetera. And so as a result of all of these sightings, the radar confirmation, et cetera, and the public interest, which was at an all-time high. And by the way, 52 was a pivotal year for UFO sightings beyond just the sightings in DC. So it was really building the interest and the consternation with the government military explanations. It was building to a crescendo. So General Sanford held a press conference where General Roger Ramey was there from Roswell lore, as well as Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. And he presented, and as you mentioned, Chrissy, stated that these sightings in no way are tied to any type of military testing or development, and that these things do not seem to pose a threat to national security. But he also went on to state, and it's a famous quote, but there are some things being seen by credible observers of relatively incredible things. And it's that small subset of the data that they're still looking to analyze. And so it was interesting. I think it allayed a lot of the concerns. The 52 wave still had a lot of UFO sightings during the summer, it tended to subside as it went into the fall. But it was one of those very public statements, and it was that kind of a tipping point, really, in the history of the military, the Pentagon's involvement into the UFO subject. And then you fast forward in time now, where we're at today, right? If the past is prologue, as they like to say. We're now seeing military are seeing tic tacs, right? We have the famous Nimitz incident. By all accounts, at least based on the information that we know today, that is not tied to any type of military experiment, although that's one of the prevalent theories. Well, they just saw something that was top secret that was being developed. But when you talk to people like Chris Mellon, when you talk to David Fravor and these individuals that witnessed these things firsthand, we're not talking something that's just 5 years down the road from an F-18 fighter. We're talking something that's radically advanced. So we tend to move in incremental steps forward as far as technological development, aerospace design, the maneuverability, as you know, Chrissy, of this Tic Tac, the velocities that this thing was traveling, the ability for this thing to have complete dominance, air dominance around these jet fighters. It goes beyond just simply saying, well, that might have been something Soviet in nature, because if they had that much of a leapfrog in technology, I don't think they'd be using it just to dance around David Fravor. I think that they'd be using it for more malevolent purposes.
For sure. And I want to also go back to other really notable historical events and committees that had been put together. So we look at, for example, the Robertson panel. So recently NASA has announced, and a lot of people know this, that the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Group of scientists to review and create a study. This just happened last year. And is this something that is very similar to something that we would consider as a modern day Robertson panel? Could we consider that, or is that too far of a stretch?
I hope, and here's the key word, I hope that NASA and organizations like the AIAA will be more transparent in their investigations. Admittedly, the CIA sponsored Robertson panel, we didn't have the notes declassified until decades later. What's interesting, though, is with NASA being scientific in nature, we have to keep in mind the CIA was an intelligence agency. And it was very telling what came out of that investigation. I believe it was a day and a half or 2 days total investigation of the subject, which I think your audience would laugh at that idea, right? In 2 days, we're going to analyze the UFO subject and we'll have conclusions and authoritative answers. It's I've been doing this, over 30 years, and I'm nowhere close to that. And yet they did it in 2 days or 2.5 days. But what was really telling is that out of that, and by the way, nice that we're bringing this up because the Robertson panel was brought about as a direct result of what happened the preceding year in the summer of '52, what we talked about with what Washington, D.C. The concern was not that UFOs necessarily pose a threat to national security, but that UFOs, the idea of UFOs, could be exploited by the Soviets to simulate a UFO sighting to clog communication channels, because that actually happened during the 2 Saturdays in Washington, D.C. So many people were calling in that it was clogging communication and switchboard lines in D.C. That was a communication concern. And so obviously communication factors into national security. So that was kind of the impetus for putting the Robertson panel together. What was interesting is one of the conclusions out of the Robertson panel, despite their somewhat abbreviated study or investigation, was that the subject of UFOs should be debunked, that an actual effort of debunking should occur. And it also recommended the spying on of UFO organizations and UFO investigators. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories regarding UFOs and UFO organizations, UFO individuals, most of which usually doesn't have a very good foundation. Again, if we go back to the provenance and you trace it back, I like to say for those conspiracy theorists out there, this is something we can point to where we can say the government clearly stated in their own words, we have the official government documents with the official provenance. Here is in writing, codified, a plan to debunk the subject and to spy on UFO organizations and groups.
It's scary. It's to be honest, and like having them agreeing to do that takes away so much of your own liberties, so much of your own privacy. Do you think that organizations in the government agencies are doing that now as well?
Well,
I know
that's something I always ask myself. I don't obviously have an answer. I wouldn't have insights to prove or disprove that. But what's interesting is there's no statute of limitations, or there's no expiration date on these recommendations. So are they still in effect? I don't know. I'm sure some of your audience may be able to attest to personal experiences they've had that might point one way or the other, but I just don't have the authority to say one way or the other definitively. We've seen certainly in Project Blue Book years later, where they went from what I think they started, like I said, as a valid attempt to understand the subject during Project Sign. It then morphed into Project Grudge and ultimately Project Blue Book. And I know a lot of people, they have a bad taste in their mouth when we bring up Project Blue Book. And again, we have thousands of the case files right here, original case files from Hynek, which are extremely exciting to go through and to see Hynek's little marginalia written on there. But we have to keep in mind, these are legitimate cases that were documented. Read the pilot reports, look at the radar tracking of these objects, look at the photographs in some cases, ignore the conclusions. I always tell people that come and visit that go through the original Project Blue Book files, by all means, go through those. At least we know those are official government documents, and we have the name of the pilots, we have the name of the radar operators in many cases. When you get down to conclusions, you fill in the blank. I always ask everyone to make their own conclusions regarding these cases. But a lot of people, they say, well, Blue Book, they just debunked it all. They did, but we have to remember over 12,700 cases are documented. These are data points. These are potential data points with any of these case files. We have thousands of case files, if not tens of thousands of Blue Book files here. We have APRO, we have NICAP. These case files number in the tens of thousands. Imagine taking all of that data, and Chrissy, you and I have talked about this before. Imagine taking all that and putting it into a database, or letting AI technology data crunch all of that. Again, this being the largest collection of data on the subject in civilian hands in the United States. And that's something that we hope to do at the National UFO Historic Records Center. First and foremost, getting a building so we can expand our digitization efforts. But once all this material is digitized, and I've had discussions with some IT individuals over the last 2 years, we would like to partner with organizations that would, one, not want to monetize and not control the data, but utilize the technology to better understand it and make all of that information available to the general public.
Those data sets are going to be unbelievable.
Well,
the stuff, the correlations that AI will find.
Exactly. In fact, Chrissy, I was just thinking about this the other day. Imagine all of these case files that have been collected going back to 1947, and some even predate 47, because admittedly, when organizations started forming in the 50s, people were saying, you know, I saw something back in 1911 or 1912, and we have case files going back that far. But imagine all of these decades, all of these researchers on their own time, on their own dime, not only nationally, but internationally, collecting this data. We have all kinds of South American case files here, European case files. All of the people that were involved in collecting that data over decades. I mean, just think about the energy and the time and the money commitments. We now have it all centralized for the first time in history. We have the data together. Imagine, though, that all of those case files just sitting in filing cabinets for decades, waiting for technology to get where we are today. Because as you mentioned, we can have some of the smartest people watching the show, listening to the show, scientists in their own little spheres wanting to look at the data. But what if this isn't enough? What if we need AI technology to actually fully capture the scope and breadth of all of this data? And isn't it interesting if we actually would be able to gain insights into the mystery after all these years, that we had the data, and thank God, and this really underscores what we're trying to do, we preserve the data, we centralize it, only to have technology catch up and finally present itself to where now we can give that data to the software engineers and let the data and the algorithms do their work.
It'd be so exciting to find out what comes out of it, along with then government agencies being able to do that if they're not already doing it. You know, I've spoken
Absolutely.
to Jacques Vallée, where he's talked about using AI, you know, as a computer as a computer scientist, been using AI for years, right? It's just way more advanced now. But looking at those American government databases that they have and all of those correlations, and then going to you and saying, what do we have as civilian researchers along with other academics, and being able to put all of that information together and then really synthesize it and come to maybe a closer conclusion. Like, hopefully we get to that point in time.
We look forward to collaborating. We look forward to that collaboration. Again, as long as, I can't emphasize this enough because I think it's counterintuitive to what we're doing if we do otherwise, it has to be made available to the public. This cannot be something that operates in a private sphere. My attitude is, and those that have been here, those that have worked with me over the years know this, those that have attended my lectures know this information belongs to everyone. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think anyone should have ownership over the UFO data. I believe the information is so important, it should be opened up. And that's, again, part of the digitization effort. We'd like to eventually get all this material digitized and uploaded. It takes time, it takes money, and we're slowly but surely trying to gather that. But what we have gathered thus far is the data. So now we just need the money to put the mechanisms in place to get us to the digitization, to then move us into that sphere as you were describing. And admittedly, we've all heard in the last year or so, AI has kind of gotten a bad rap. There's been a lot of negativity with regard to AI. The way I look at it, AI is like a gun. It's a tool, and it depends on how you wield it, you, the individual. I can have a hammer, I can kill you with it, but I can also build you a house with it. And I see AI as that. I don't think it should be stigmatized for what it is, because I think there's tremendous value in what it can yield, especially when we're dealing with the voluminous amount of data that we're now sitting on.
I 100% agree. How far back do you think the government should go looking at UAP historical incidences or records? You know, we know that they're going back to Trinity. Should they go even farther? Should we look at the 1800s of any, maybe don't have data from that, let's say, or we only have so much historical records, I would say. But how far should the government go back?
Yeah, I would recommend going back to 47. And the only reason I say that is we started getting more substantive reports. And I say that as someone that has, when looking at triangular UFOs, for example, going back through the 20th century, but I did find in scientific journals from the late 1800s reports of triangular appearances in the sky. The problem with that is, though, despite finding those references, they're very short on details. And unfortunately, if you're going to utilize this in an AI framework, if you're going to be looking for discrete data points associated with each case, you start looking back into the 1800s, and you're just not going to find the level of detail that you want. In 47 and in 48, though, where Army, Air Force, and eventually Air Force investigators started looking at the subject, they had standardized report forms. And much like NICAP, much like APRO, much like CUFOS or MUFON, now you have a standardized questionnaire where you're ensuring you're getting all of those data points. But when you start getting back really prior to 47, it gets the data. I'm not saying that the data is not valid, but you don't have as much substance to the reports.
Right. That would make sense. Now, can we speak about David Grush? You know, I've been really curious based on his claims. He has a variety of different things he's said.
Yeah.
Within the claims, do you feel that there might be aspects of folklore that he's more referencing towards rather than maybe the potential evidence? And if so, what maybe would those folklore elements be?
Yeah, let me, before I answer that, I'll preface by saying I don't know
Sure.
Dave Grush. I only know what everyone else has seen and heard. I've never exchanged a voicemail, email, or anything. So I don't know him personally. So I want to preface that before I
For
start
sure.
making any statements. That being said, though, the initial discussion that was made public by Ross Coulthart, he references a 1933 incident involving Mussolini. The hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood on end because, again, if you know your history, if you've only gotten into this in the last few years, you may not know this, but this was a story that came up in the late 90s, early 2000s, and in my opinion, was thoroughly debunked by Eduardo Russo, one of the most credible Italian researchers over in Europe, as well as working with the National Archives there. And they determined that although some of the documents in this document set were legitimate, other ones apparently were forged. And so it immediately called into question the whole narrative. Then later, now in 2023, Grush is coming forward with claims referencing this as a legitimate event. So how do you marry those two things? I tend to respect, because I know him. I was just on a call with Eduardo about a week ago. I tend to respect the Italian researchers over there that have really, I think, done a good job of trying to deconstruct that story. But it raises the question, as you mentioned, Chrissy, and this is from the very first interview I watched, I immediately asked myself, what is he speaking of from firsthand knowledge versus what has he been told?
Right.
Again, I can use a historical corollary for this. Many people often will erroneously cite Edgar Mitchell, Apollo astronaut, as confirming Roswell occurred. If you go back and look, and we have most of the documents here and the transcripts and the video interviews, if you really look back at what he says, yes, if you believe the stories and what I've been told, Roswell occurred, Roswell happened, blah, 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 blah. He never spoke from firsthand knowledge. Now, I don't care if you're an Apollo astronaut. I don't care if you worked at the NRO like Grush did in geospatial intelligence. You can still succumb to the rumor mill. You can still succumb to repeating things that were told to you by who you thought was credible, but could have been an error. And now you're regurgitating that. So is he speaking from firsthand knowledge? If he's speaking from firsthand knowledge, then either he's telling the truth or he's lying. Right? There's no middle of the road. If you say, I saw this, I know it happened because I was there, then it comes down to two things. You're telling the truth, and we need to have verifiable evidence to back up the story, or it's a lie. There's no ambiguity in that situation. However, if he's basing this on secondhand testimony, because I heard this from an intelligence friend who knows another intelligence friend, it's the telephone game. And how do we go back and how do we verify that? Even if what he's saying is based on secondhand information, at the end of the day, any testimony and bombshell testimony, let's admit that, Chrissy, we have captured aliens and bodies and biologics, we have crash saucers. All of this demands corroboration. I'm not going to believe David Grush any more than I'm going to just believe Bob Lazar at face value. I don't believe any story unless I can try to verify or validate these stories. Because if you believe based on pure belief, you're now in a faith-based system bordering on religion. Again, are we talking about science, or are you just wanting to support a belief system that you already have? And so we must demand corroboration. We must demand evidence to back it up. I'm not here to judge the man. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm not saying he's telling the truth. I'm waiting for that additional evidence to surface to support either way.
Yeah, I agree with you. And there, hopefully, we'll find out if more whistleblowers are
Sure.
coming out, right? It maybe this
Absolutely.
year, we'll see. And I think that's a really great way of being able to critically think and analyze when these whistleblowers start coming out, consistently and start saying these messaging, because it doesn't mean that everyone's telling the truth.
Yeah, and
It doesn't,
if I can just
for
add
sure.
an
Yes,
example,
go ahead.
there's a reason that I'm saying this too. I'm not just someone that believes things arbitrarily. There's an individual who I won't mention that was working in DC and working with legislators. This is in the last 2 years. And I can't say the name because they asked me to just not to mention it, but I'm going to mention it because at least the story without the individual's name, because of where I'm going to go with the story. The individual shared with me and my colleagues that we were on a virtual call as I was sitting in this very chair. We were talking about what's going on in DC and the legislation and so forth. And the individual said, well, I was shown some photos that were purportedly top secret Project Blue Book photos. And they shared these in confidence, but I'd like to share them with you to get your take on it. And there was this whole backstory to the whole thing. Obviously, I was intrigued. So the individual puts their phone up to the camera like this, and much like my hand right now, the focus is trying to zero in and adjust. Finally, the blurry image comes into stark clarity, and they were saying, this is one of the best photos. And they hold it up, and immediately, and I wish I had this recorded because we could not have rehearsed it any better. Barry Greenwood, who was on the call, and myself, in unison, beautifully at the same time, said, those are the Paul Villa photos. And the individual pulls the phone back, their face went white. And they're like, you've seen these photos? I said, not only have we seen the photos, they were published on postcards back in the 1960s saying, look, flying saucers are real. I have several copies right behind me over here on the bookshelf. I said, and I have the NICAP case file on the case. We have the Project Blue Book case file on the case with Hynek's personal notations on it. I said, I have copies of all the other photographs that this person took. They were hoaxed photos. It was a contactee, very weird individual. And just recently in the APRO files, I have original copies of the photographs with some of the wild ramblings this guy was writing about the Space Brothers and aliens. And I said, and ironically enough, these photographs that you just showed me were taken about a half hour from where I live, right here in the Albuquerque, New Mexico area. I said, so yes, I'm well acquainted with this case. The look on the individual's face, and they reiterated, I was presented that these were top secret Project Blue Book photos. Well, and first off, when I heard that, Chrissy, Project Blue Book was never classified top secret. So using that terminology was not appropriate for Project Blue Book.
Right.
Now, the 4602nd Air Intelligence, maybe, or some of the other agencies, there could have been top secret UFO-related materials, but not within Blue Book itself. Researchers used to come into Blue Book and they would share case files with them. Phil Klass being one of them. I have original correspondence where he went to Wright Pat to look at UFO files. But the point is, this individual is someone that should be aware of that, or at least be wary of just accepting material like that at face value. Long story short, I sent the individual copies of everything that I just described. And the response that I got from the individual was, thank you, you just saved my ass. He said, we were going to go ahead and spend thousands of dollars to digitally analyze these photos. Wow. And my response was, anytime you're presented with material like this, contact me and my colleagues. We don't need to know the source. We don't need to know where and when you obtained it. Just simply throw out a word or throw out a location. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1962, May. Does that ring a bell? Is there any significance to that? And use us, because as Jay, one of our associates that works with us, has often stated, and I don't mention it much because it sounds self-aggrandizing, it's not just the materials that we have, it's the brain trust that we have amongst all of our historians and researchers, because we've explored most of these cases over the years. We know the provenance, we know the lineage of these stories and how they've been told, retold, added on to over the years, embellished. And so use us as a sniff test. But I say that because I've witnessed it firsthand with information being shared purportedly from a credible source given to another credible source, and they accepted it at face value. If I've witnessed that firsthand, is it beyond the pale to assume Grush may have gone down that road?
100%. I agree with you. I think that's happening more than people imagine. You know, I think they're showing, yeah, right. And we've seen that this has happened before. And we look at, Richard Doty,
Yes.
doing disinformation campaigns and showing fake documents to Linda Moulton Howe.
Yes.
All of this stuff, unfortunately, has happened.
It happened. It happened.
Right.
But I want to be very clear, because I know there's very fervent Grush believers out there. I'm not saying he's lying.
Right.
The individual I spoke with was very sincere. He was not trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Grush, I believe, is telling what he believes to be true. But all I'm simply saying is, in that process of sharing of information, could some misinformation, disinformation accidentally gotten in there? And the sad thing is, even if 90% of what he said is true, if you've got 10% of erroneous information that you're quoting as gospel truth, it taints your credibility.
Then how do we go about briefing congressmen and women about the UFO topic?
Well, that's something I'd like to do starting in 2024. I do know some individuals who are working on the Hill with legislators. I've stated that I would actually like to go out to DC to meet with some of the legislators to let them know about the history that we do have. And in fact, related to that, I've just recently been put in touch with the National Archives. We have a young researcher by the name of Ryan, who's doing incredible research at the National Archives. And he has recently been in touch with some of the chief archivists, and they've expressed interest in reaching out to the National UFO Historic Records Center, given the fact they have to now be tasked with putting this UAP records collection together. And so they see us as a potential resource to maybe help guide them in that area. And so, as we mentioned earlier, Chrissy, we look to collaborate. We're willing to collaborate with government as long as it's, at the end, the information's transparent, but we also look to work with the National Archives. We would welcome that opportunity.
So then, outside of just working with politicians, what else is the goals for the archives or for the National Record Center? What is the goal in the end that you would like to have? Yeah, what would you like that to look like?
Well, I think the ultimate goal would be answers, right? I think that's why we're all here. I mean, some people like to chase the mystery for the sake of the mystery. I don't. To me, the UFO subject is like an itch I can't scratch. I want answers to this mystery, at the very least, insights. It might be arrogant to assume we're ever going to have answers to this subject, but definitive insights into the subject would be wonderful. But in the short term, I think that the National UFO Historic Record Center serves as a vehicle, as a bastion of credibility to counter the misinformation that's on Twitter or X, the information that's on Facebook, that's on Reddit, to bypass misinformation like this that continually resurfaces time and time again. We think we explain it and people understand it, and then a new crop of individuals comes into the field, and then they seize upon it, and then they repost it. And it's probably a bad analogy, but I referenced to one of my researchers. I said, this damn photo is like herpes. It just keeps resurfacing and flaring up every now and again. And so if we could counter some of that misinformation, disinformation, I think it's going to help people that sincerely are coming into this. And I've had people at conferences tell me, Dave, I'm new to the UFO subject. I want to learn, but I don't know what's credible and what's not. And so if we can create an institution that serves as a guiding principle, that can call out the BS for what it is, but also shine a light on the truly anomalous cases like Falcon Lake in Manitoba, like Shag Harbor and other cases. I think that the UFO community needs that, to be quite honest. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. Again, I'm referencing the organization, which is comprised of numerous historians and archivists and materials that we have. And again, many people say things in the UFO subject, it's not often that they can point to why they're saying that. And that's everything that we have to say has to be backed up by contemporaneous documents. So it's not my opinion or what I think or what I believe. It's like, no, this is what we actually have in the form of official documentation. And so if anybody questions that, they can come here or we can send them the digital copies. But that's something else, too, that is one of our I guess you could say, cardinal rules. We are a records center. I've talked about the fact that, everyone is digitizing now, as we are. But Chrissy, I see in the next 20, 25 years, a lot of this material is going to be digitized. And I think rightly so, there's going to be skeptics in the general public and academia and science that are going to question, okay, I've seen this PDF, this Adobe document that references this. How do I know that's a real document?
100%, yes.
We can easily and fabricate documents. We saw that with MJ12 back in the 1980s. Yeah. So I think it is incumbent upon us as the Record Center, the holder of the largest amount of actual hard copy history, to retain the originals. And why I say that is we now have forensics you can apply to that document. Okay, you don't believe the PDF? Here's the original government document. You can test the paper, the watermark. You can see the rusted staple holes in the upper left-hand corner. Here's the letterhead. You can test the ink. Here's the typeset that you can look at.
Well, and I love that you brought that up. I actually have some documents on my wall that I framed that are replicas. They were photocopied from allegedly being real documents from the MJ12. And as someone who loves artifacts like that, I framed them because people were like, well, they're not real. And the FBI said they weren't real. And I said, the whole point that it's not real, it's still a wonderful piece of history that people thought it was real.
Exactly.
I said, and there's something to that. Right. And I said, and that's the reason why I have them. Yeah. And I said,
and we house material on every aspect of the phenomenon here, regardless of what we feel might be valid or invalid, because exactly as you pointed out, all of this, every aspect of the UFO subject, every document, book, etc., recording, it's part of the history. And when we have researchers come here, I'm not a huge fan of the contactee claims from the 1950s, but a sociologist might be wanting to write a book on that movement of the pseudo-religious anti-atomic war movement that occurred in the 1950s, known as the UFO contactees. They may want to write a book and study that chapter. Well, where are they going to go to find that material? We have tons of original documents, many autographed editions from the famous contactees from the 1950s. We never know what someone wants to come and research, and we never know what one person's belief over another's is going to be. We want to be a central repository, as you mentioned, Chrissy, for all of it.
Right. And even those false documents are still, part of history. For example, the story that, I have with these documents were given to my dad. And this is an insane story. I've actually never told this, but it's an insane story, but it's interesting. And you wonder, way before the internet, how things like this could get, disseminatized throughout from country to country. Right. So long story short, my dad was friends with a trucker that was down in the States. Mm-hmm. He picked up a hitchhiker. The hitchhiker had a backpack filled of these documents that were photocopies of this, MJ12 document about Roswell and UFOs and yada, yada, yada. And so he was going around and giving them out. And he told my dad's friend and said to him, my father was killed talking about this as this secret. And so it's my duty as his son to be able to spread this word. Again, way before the internet. So then I said to my dad, even though now we know they're not real, and we had them forever in my dad's safe. Forever, because we were never sure, right? We were like, wow, if this is real, like this is unbelievable, right? So we hid them out for the longest period of time, and dad would bring them out when friends would come out and we'd all look at them. And so I was so young, I would try to read them and he would say to me, you're too young, you have to wait till you get older to understand it, Chrissy. So now I have them, which is great. They were passed down. But the big part of this though, which I find really interesting that we've spoken about, is that maybe that was a potential disinformation campaign. Way before the internet, you get a guy that's a hitchhiker and put all of these documents in a backpack and he's just giving them out. It's the perfect way to spread disinformation.
Well, so, and also to play
who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. Who knows? And to play devil's advocate for any MJ12 enthusiasts.
For sure. Yeah.
As we collect this data, perhaps we'll find an element that makes us rethink our position on the whole affair. I mean, let's keep an open mind. Maybe we were presumptuous in some respects, or maybe, as much disinformation is, it's truth blended in with falsehood. It's a combination. And maybe another document will surface down the line that sheds light on an element within those documents. Whereas we had thrown the baby out with the bathwater. It's like, okay, wait a minute. This is an official document. We know the history, and it seems to corroborate an element that was in those documents.
For sure. And it doesn't mean that, for example, if it is a disinformation campaign, you can have elements of truth within that or within those documents. You're right, that do prove that maybe a part of this was right and another part was not. So, or it was just being meant to be misleading.
All of the data is important, and it's important to preserve it, because especially with new revelations that come forward, it may make us rethink or reevaluate cases that we had dismissed long ago, MJ12 or otherwise.
For sure. Thank you so much, David Marler. I'm really looking forward to like going and touching the documents with gloves.
This year, right,
gloves. Yes, 100%. And just see them. I'm so excited to just be around that history too. I think it's so amazing. So thank you so much on behalf of so many people that love the UFO topic for just keeping all of those hard copies and all of the history, because someone has to do it, and I'm happy it's you.
We have to preserve the history. Otherwise, people are going to rewrite the history the way they want. And we got to make sure we have an accurate retelling of the history.
100%. I agree. And I have so much respect for that. And as I say to all my guests too, David, thank you for being rebelliously curious with me today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chrissy.